Næstur á mælendaskrá Christophe Egret. Christophe arkitekt og annar eigenda Studio Egret West í London og gestakennari víða heim. Christophe mun fjalla endurnýjunarverkefnið Park Hill í Sheffield, en fyrir það fékk hann Ripa-verðlaunin. Park Hill hefur í áratugi verið mikið deiluefni minjaverndar Bretlands og borgaryfirvalda og hafa margir blandast inn í þær deilur. Please welcome Christophe Egret.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Haldor, for this lovely story that you gave just now, and thank you for inviting me to talk today in Iceland. I'm really, really excited about that. I have an image on the screen which is not the same as the image on the... Brendan, I've got your presentation here.
Do we have this guy? Here, just take that down. Yeah, you probably have to be here. Yeah, you have to be, you don't see it on this screen.
Okay.
There's a video.
So I'm going to try in less than an hour to talk to you about to answer the question of giving modernism a second chance. And just before I do that, I would like to quickly introduce our studio. I'm half of Studio Egret West, the other half, I'm an architect. The other half is David West, who is an urban designer. And it's quite important that in this question about modernism to clarify that we are a 50-50 combination of urbanism and architecture. And in a way, it starts to answer the question of whether you have a moral view of what, because of urbanism starts to talk about how do we live and the social conscience of what we do, bringing the specificity or the specific nature of architecture with the strategic nature of urbanism has a different approach to architecture. This is our studio in Clerkenwell in London. This is our studio grouping in Hamburg, where we did a little studio trip. I'm just showing you that just so you know they are kind of young, nice people in our studio. And I'm going to talk to you about 4 projects. The last one will be about Park Hill, and I'll go into some detail. But I thought I would make it more interesting by talking about 3 other projects, one of which is Alton Park in Roehampton, the Balfron Tower in East London, the TheOld VinylFactory, which is where the Beatles recorded their first albums and so on. And then finally, I will talk about Park Hill. But maybe before that, I just want to quickly talk about modernism. You know, when we say, should we give modernism a second chance? The modernists didn't feel like they had to give anybody a second chance. They would just slice everything out and start again with a nice tabula rasa. And I think that was maybe, you know, the only other time that would happen in a city is after a big fire or a big war, like in London or in Rotterdam. And I like this slide very much because it's a graphic artist, cartoonist called Robert Crumb who did the history of America in 8 slides. And what you can see is that just slightly, image by image, there's a road, there is a railway, there is a power line, there is a bit of advertising. And we are able to absorb these changes because they are incremental. But if we went from that to that, it would hurt. And I think that is essentially one of the big issues that we have to deal with. How fast can we absorb change? And how quickly can we allow history to evolve? And I like, there's something I like very much about this image. For me, that is like the archetypical Italian hilltop village. And what's happened is that it's in constant evolution the church the castle goes on the top of the hill, then the church is put there, then they put a school, then you add a few houses. And all the time, the decision about architecture and about skyline and all of that is taken one at a time by a slow progression. And then modernism sort of inherited a completely different challenge. The challenge was the Industrial Revolution, mass production, the move from rural to urban at a speed that we can't really appreciate. And therefore, they were following rules that were very specific to that time. And we are now in a kind of slower, more able to kind of think about what the meaning of all those changes were. And I'll come back to Park Hill, but I just mentioned Park Hill because this is a really interesting point that by luck, I guess, the architect of Park Hill is still alive. He's called Ivor Smith. And they were completely obsessed with the cluster of four flats linked to a street in the sky, and a geometry of architecture that was based on a sort of cellular diagram of 130-degree angles, and it was superbly intelligent in its microcosm. But had they been given a chance, they would never stop. They would just keep on building that snake that would just go over the Yorkshire Hills and keep on going, because in their mind, that little microcosm was perfect, and they just had forgotten about how you root a building to its context. So the point here is superb intelligence at a certain level, complete craziness at the other level. And this is the plan. That's the same plan, and you can really imagine how you've got around it. You've got a structure of streets and courtyards and so on. And then suddenly this object lands, and then the most painful thing about it is that the spaces in between are called green spaces. They're called open spaces, and that means very little. So this is the view from the city. You can see the old poor houses with toilets in the garden at the bottom, and the people are moved into Park Hill, which is in the background here. And it's, if seen from a certain angle, it looks like a fortress. And you have the streets in the sky, and you have the schools and the little shops, and you have the balconies where you can I'll talk about routes. This slide is in the wrong place. But there was not that sense of being forced. Modernism felt that they could deal with objects, and they didn't have to deal with urbanity and with the tight-knit grids of certain cities. And so this is what we inherited. When I started work on Park Hill 8-9 years ago, that was a sort of situation I was faced with, and there was really little choice but to do something like that. I talked about rooting a building to its surrounding. And this is, for me, this is the Balfron Tower. This is a really good example of the lack of placemaking. You have a building that lands, and then you have where children should be playing, where people should be enjoying their community. It's all about fences and barriers and bad benches and no trees and so on and so forth. So immediately, when we draw, we try and imagine how suddenly you change the textures and how you remove the barriers and how you create planting. And immediately, from this image to this image, you've transformed how the building lands and touches the ground. The same thing happened with Park Hill. That was the master plan we inherited. And on the right, we immediately gave specific uses to all the green spaces, from bowling green to allotments to private gardens, and really help focusing on defining what was public and what was private. I'll come on to this also later. This is the old vinyl factory. This is the factory that I want to talk about later on. And this is on the left-hand side, it's Erno Goldfinger and the Balfron Tower. And on the right, it's Walmsley, the chief architect of Sheffield, in front of Park Hill. And very much already, you've got a sense of the heroic nature of architecture in modernism. It's like these people were going to change the world, and they were going to be photographed in front of their buildings in a sort of, with a camera below them and the buildings sort of exploding behind them. And I'm really pleased to say that architecture today doesn't feel like that at all. It feels like we collaborate with other people. The architecture is not as important as the placemaking, and a certain the architecture is less object and more about placemaking. And these were the buildings that came from there. That they have, already this entrance is not touching the ground at the Balfron Tower. It's sort of elevated. And you can recognize the imagery of a castle and its drawbridge, and so you're entering something that doesn't really belong to its surrounding. It's sort of isolating. And so there is a choice. The choice would be to just get rid of it and say it was an era of mistake and it didn't work. But there is also maybe a second way, and I'm just now taking just a little step sideways and talk about architecture and urbanism in our studio. This is a sort of wheel that I doodled a few years ago about how we approach our work. And the first 1, 2, 3, 4 segments are to do with urbanism and thinking, and 5, 6, 7, and 8 are to do with architecture. Not strictly quite as systematic as that, but the first segment is about when you approach a building, you listen to it, you look at the views, you try and smell the site. And the second one is deciding what to keep. And for us, keeping a building is sometimes it would be so much easier to just demolish a building, but to keep a building creates an obstruction, and that obstruction makes it, first of all, more interesting, a little bit more difficult, but the rewards are extraordinary. And then finally, you move to type 3, which is about narrative and storytelling and finding the good reasons to do whatever we're doing and changing the uses. And 4 is about the sense of well-being, the social cohesion, and the celebrating the human element of architecture. And it's only in the next 4 stages that we then talk about form, massing, and so on. And this is a great freedom, because so many architects often start with the object, and then they start trying to fit uses in it and good reasons for doing their form. Whereas if you start from the other standpoint, you're in a much stronger position. And then we sketch, we draw and we sketch and we dream and we try to avoid, not always successfully, to use the computer immediately. And that is a really good way of engaging with communities, engaging with clients, in imagining what is possible. This was a painting I did for Park Hill, exploring a change of color in the scheme, which was for English Heritage, which is the listing body in England, a real challenge. And then it's the idea for me. I have no problem in accepting that the building that I am designing today will be changed in 10, 20, 50, certainly in 100 years' time if they survive that long. And I find the combination of classical architecture and modern architecture really interesting, and therefore we have to accept that. So I'm going to talk to you first about Alton Park. Alton Park, 1959, very much Corbusian unité d'habitation sort of concept, really beautiful building, probably even more elegant in the landscape than the Marseille unité d'habitation, sort of in rolling hills, landscape really flowing under the building. And again, like Le Corbusier, superb intelligence at the micro level of streets in the sky, cross ventilation, gauche system for refuse, centralized heating system, fresh air, wonderful views, balconies everywhere. Those are really quite extraordinary values. But they've, over the time, through no mistake of one single person, the refuse system has gone completely wrong. The cars have gone around the building and stopped the nature from flowing underneath the building. The shops half of them have closed because they're no longer right for purpose. And so our strategy was to keep those lovely modernist buildings, to extend the high street, to connect with the old village, to create new uses within the Alton Park area, and to leave alone. Actually, in this example, we actually left the modernist building alone, apart from a few tweaks, and we just added a new grain and a new sense of street and a new sense of different uses that would help this community to continue to live. And then we also make connections with Richmond Park, which is a really big park around Alton Park. And then we created a new leisure center, and we created, again, there was this idea of green spaces that were non-specific, and we just added uses to them so that they became places that people were attracted to. The Old Vinyl Factory is a different project altogether. So it's, as I said a little while ago, it was the home of EMI. It was at the time when the gramophone was a new thing, and you built cabinets, and you built you pressed records, and you made sleeves, and you did the recordings, and the artists would come there, and it was a whole industry. It was practically a village in itself. And then there was a few remaining buildings, and it's not far from another business park called Stockley Park. And it could have gone in one direction, which is fill the voids with cars and turn all these existing buildings into boring offices. And it actually financially didn't work out, but it would have been also, in my eyes anyway, a negative. And that's a typical Stockley Park arrangement. But again, like in that first phase, when you go and see a building and you smell the history of it, we were looking at, this is the powerhouse. This is where the power of all that EMI village would come from. And they have those turbines turning all night long. And there was trains going through this little village to take cabinets from one place to another. Or these extraordinary, slightly Art Deco building. And what do you do with them? This was the cabinet building. And that site before we inherited was called London Gateway, which is the most horrible name you can give to, it's near Heathrow and it's on the Gateway, and it's just, how dull it's going to be. And we changed it to the Old Vinyl Factory. And immediately there's suddenly a poetry about that place. And we found a plan with all the old names of all the buildings, and it was the cabinet building and the powerhouse and the boiler house and so on. And by giving them a name rather than a number, and also by reconnecting the high street, which is on the right-hand side, with the site of the EMI space, we created offices, leisure facilities, schools, squares, housing, museum, and so on. And so we created a real extension of a city. This is the plan, and the crucial element is that sort of dark green line that goes through the very center of that and becomes the lane, and on that lane you have the name of all the records that were printed over the last 60 years in that place. And at that point, I just show this slide because when I mentioned the changing from London Gateway to the Old Vinyl Factory, there is the importance of being so proud that you think about branding, you talk about the name of it. And so before we even did any work on the buildings, we opened a cafe, we called it Rock and Roll, we put Old Vinyl Factory in proud letters in the front of the building, so everybody coming by would know that there was something new about to happen. And it already became a success, even though only 2 of the buildings are on site as we speak. And again, the idea of sketching and sketching the old with the new and seeing how they work together, not dissimilar to that Bath museum I showed you earlier of the classical and the new extension. And these are a mixture. I won't go into too much detail about the plan other than to say that this is a much denser massing with different uses with the different colors. This is one of the first buildings, which has a really lovely courtyard that you can feel that a community could build around it. This is the boiler house on the right-hand side and the powerhouse in the background. The powerhouse during the day with an extension with a cafe, putting the new power systems of the whole vinyl factory inside it, and also creating new recording studio facilities for young generations. And then the main square. The Balfron Tower the Balfron Tower is the first tower by Erno Golfinger. Erno Golfinger was a Hungarian architect who came to London. He was known to have a very strong character, and he built the Balfron, and then 2 or 3 years later designed the Trellick Tower, which is probably better known because it's in the west of London. And again, like Le Corbusier, but in a slightly different way, he was thinking about social housing, about social cohesion, about how to build vertical villages, and build this tower. Well, he built this tower, and he also built 2 other buildings around it, around some landscape. And what we did was to just give ourselves, as we probably do on every project, give ourselves 10 principles that we are going to follow and which are going to give us the good reasons for doing what we do. And it's it becomes our sort of passport with the client about, do you agree with what we're going to do? And they say yes. And as long as we agree with those principles, which are different from concepts. Concepts are very rigid, I feel, whereas principles have a kind of graceful ability to adapt to changing parts of the brief. And our first sketch was to really link the Balfron Tower, which is a sort of strange geometry on the left-hand side, with the rest of the pedestrian proposals. And then again, I'll talk enormously about landscape, and even in our studio, we are about 50, and there are 4 landscape designers, 4 really good landscape designers. They don't know the names of plants, but they know the materials, they know the species that will respond to wind and so on, and they also really understand about placemaking. So it's a really interesting element which really helps to root buildings to their context, and also to immediately think about not what it feels like to be in the building, but to actually how do you approach the building. And I think a lot of the modernist buildings' problem is that they're really good for the people who live in them, but they're not really good for the people in the 99% who don't live in them. And this is the landscape that we inherited. And it's actually quite important to say that the landscape designer profession didn't really exist in the 60s. There was garden designers who would do lovely, pretty gardens in the back gardens or in the Sissinghurst. But there wasn't a profession of landscape public realm profession as there is now. And I think that is one of the great lessons that we've learned. And this is the view from the top of the tower looking down, and this is our sketch immediately bringing the landscape to life. And, you know, brutalism means raw in French, and sometimes in the psyche of people it also means brutal. But when you put concrete with vegetation and greenery together, they really look fantastic. This is a few photographs from the Barbican from Corbusier's Milona building and somewhere else, I don't know. And so we were able to transform this into this. This is the main entrance to the tower, and they've put dustbins in the main entrance. I mean, and you can imagine that somebody at some stage thought that was a really good idea, and then you get this accumulation of bad ideas, and then there's a point where you have to make a big change. So. And this is actually a small change, just putting the dustbin downstairs and just putting a little bit of planting on the left, and the entrance feels welcoming. This is the playground for children. I think it was the playground for Erno Goldfinger imagining children in it. And so we really took the... We understood that he wanted to create a little castle for children to play in, but he hadn't understood how parents would supervise the children and so on. And so we put planting, we put glass balustrades, we made the concrete a little bit less dangerous, and we integrated it into the overall square. This is the overall view. You see the entrance on the left-hand side, integrating the private gardens at the bottom of the tower, integrating the playground for the children, giving a sense of arrival to the whole building. And this brutalist building now lands and just becomes soft and really welcoming, and I think we are going on to planning on Wednesday next week, so wish me luck. We hope that we have won the hearts and mind of the local community. And also, we on each balcony there is a little planter, and on the planter there are plants that are watered properly, so that the whole building will be able to become a green vertical wall. And we also give a little book that you can see on the bottom left to give different types of growth for different styles of balcony plantations. I'll just go in quick detail about the facade. I won't go into too much detail. This is the existing facade, and you can see how after 50 years it just needs a lift. You know, at the time, 50 years ago, this was really modern and really insulated and so on, but today it feels a bit shabby. And this is the facade, and we really analyze how we could keep the rhythm of the windows and the planters, and yet by darkening the windows, we were able to make the concrete stand stronger, and therefore the brutalist aesthetic come out. And this is the before and after, where we repair the top of the building, we clean the concrete, we repair the cladding. And when you squint, it's the same building, but when you look and touch and feel the building, it's a different building. The east elevation is next to the A12, which has a lot of pollution, and over the years the facade just got dirtier, giving us even more good reasons to have a darker cladding. This was a reclad in the 80s, I think. And then this is our proposal, and this is the back elevation again. If you squint, it's the same building. There is respect for the Erno Goldfinger heritage. At the same time, we've given this building a second life. And then in the interior, there's issues of security, there's issues of accumulation of clutter. All these lights have been added over the years, security over the years. And so just by a few easy changes, the lobby becomes a welcoming space. Likewise, the landing at the lift doesn't have an identity, and we just give it a color. The color is the same as the tiles on the streets in the sky. We do better lighting, and then we do a bit more better graphics, and we remove the clutter. These are the streets in the sky, and these are the proposed one, with just a little bit of recess to give a bit of privacy and to give that community of 4 flats a reason to talk to each other. And then the most exciting thing is that the vertical tower has a little bridge that takes you to the flat, but the vertical tower, every other level, has an empty room, which used to have plant and so on. But in Ørnegulfinger, there was this idea of social spaces. And so we've created a cinema in one of them, a library and a sort of study space in another, a dining room so that when your flat is too small, you can invite guests like 12 or 14 to a special room. And that really does make, and there's another room which is for playing loud instruments like saxophones and pianos and drums and so on. And then the flats were also so terribly divided, and they were, it was the era of moving from Victorian houses, which were small rooms, to modernism. And the transition wasn't perfect because in Ørnegulfinger's mind, there was this idea of the open plan and the vistas and the fresh air and so on. But it ended up in sort of GLC kind of typologies. And what is interesting is that over those 50 years, 60 years, what's happened is that fire alarm systems, sprinkler systems, smoke extracts to kitchens, doors that slide into pocket walls, windows that slide sideways have become more affordable, and they completely transform how you might imagine space. Also, families have gone from 4 to 3 to 2 to 1.4 sort of average, and so you don't have as much requirement for separating spaces. So we've opened up the spaces. So this was on left the existing plan. The middle one is what we call the heritage flat, which is one of each typologies will be kept for posterity as it was. And then on the right is the open plan version. Open plan version, different duplex flat, and then kitchens and open kitchens and living room and dining room. The kind of appeal of being able to come through your entrance and see the whole flat and the whole view. And then just on the roof, turning a boring roof into something that is more of a destination and a fantastic view of London. So I come on to Park Hill, which was going to be my last project. And as I've said to you, 8-9 years ago, this was what I inherited. And I felt, I say I inherited, I didn't it was me and many other people. Amongst others, there was another architectural company called Hawkins Brown, and we were always working together, and every Monday evening we would have a drink and talk about how we evolved the project. It was really a project that benefited from conversation between two different architects. But when you see a building that is boarded up like that, is on the edge of its life, you really have to take a deep breath and you have to say, what can I do to make this place better? And it became listed. It became listed probably an inch away from its life because I'll show you why later. But this is on the right-hand side, you see Park Hill, and you see how it should be part of the whole of Sheffield. It should be completely integrated. And it was also, Park Hill was part of Hyde Park, and Hyde Park was the building that was so badly reclad that English Heritage said Park Hill has to be protected. And this is Wormsley again in his heroic pose. These are the streets on the sky, which were quite interesting because they were rehousing people who were living in another street in Sheffield and moved up into a vertical street. So in terms of social cohesion, it was a really interesting idea. But they didn't put any windows onto the streets, and they were a bit too wide, and they were really not well lit, and they became, they just didn't work, and you can see it from that image. I've talked about the lack of specific nature of the green spaces. But here is a really good image of how this extraordinary home for 990 flats, homes for 990 families, is disconnected from the city, which is Sheffield, which is a student city, which is a city that had an extraordinary industry of steel making and coal and so on. And then suddenly that industry died, and Park Hill went from being a really successful estate to what we call a sink estate, an estate where you just throw people who you don't know where to house. And this is the view from the... So there was, I could go on and on and on about the intelligence of Park Hill. The more I went to visit the building, and the more I fell in love with it. It had shops, it had a police station, it had a little church, it had a school, and the people who moved there initially were so happy. You know, they had central heating, they were in a community, they had modern kitchens, they had sanitary, they didn't have to go to the back of the garden to go to the toilet. They had the garbage system, which would drop the rubbish down the chute. And these are the successes of modernism in my mind. And then there was a decline, which I've just touched upon, about the neglect and the sink estate and the drug addiction and so on. And it's just, you know, when you see a building like that, it's just really hard. It's really hard to see how you're going to turn the other way. Look at that green space in front of it. It's just doing nothing. It's just complete. It's like, I'm stupid. It's like, and that was the back, and then that was the landscape. It was just really, and then there was the sadness of the streets, and it was some of the flats were just completely abandoned. And that was what caused English Heritage, the listing body in England, to say that we needed to list Park Hill, because that was Hyde Park a little bit further, which was insensitive recladding. And so the key player in this was Urban Splash. Urban Splash are developers from Manchester, and they had little by little developed this approach of taking old buildings and giving them a second life. And then they took on Park Hill, and they had a really good reputation for doing that transformation. And so when we were brought in, I just wrote 10 principles that I felt were like what I talked about earlier, the passports for agreeing with the client what to do. And, you know, first of all, place and community, helping the containment of that space, defining points of entries and making them secure, having a concierge and so on, defining the private and the public. This is the kind of laissez-faire of not knowing what is private and what is public is always a danger area. What to do with the car? Something happened quite funny. In the 60s, there was few cars. Then in the 90s and 2000, there was a lot of cars. And then suddenly, the requirement for cars has dropped again, and so it's no longer a problem. Public realm in landscape, I've already bored you with it forever. Making a bit of soul into the streets in the sky was important. And the final point was, and the flats are the easy bit. And this was meant as a slight joke, but I thought it was important. And these were the architectural principles. I'm not going to go into detail about that. And we started to dream. We started to dream about, you know, what was important about this building. And to us, it was the grid. The grid of concrete was so strong that you could practically take everything out and just put softness and curtains and color and chandeliers and so on, and create a place worth going to. And then we became a bit more serious and just defined about what was the real qualities we wanted to preserve, such as the flatness, the fact that the Park Hill, the hill goes down, but the building remains horizontal. And that was, in English heritage terms, that was an important thing to protect. And then the other key thing was to make the first 3 floors as transparent as possible, to break the sense of fortress, to create a sense of transparency, and to create a new use. We proposed hotels and offices and all of that at ground level. And suddenly, it's no longer just housing, it's housing and shops and offices and hotels and so on. Preserving the grid, I've just mentioned it. Repairing the balustrades. And then, I guess we felt that if Park Hill was going to have a second life, it needed an injection of something. And the something was, when you see it from a distance, the building was just sad. And just to add a touch of color, and that touch of color to relate to the different levels of the streets in the sky, felt like the right thing to do. So here you see the transparency of the first 3 levels. You also see this is a CGI, the opening, the large opening with the green wall, which is the new main entrance. This is the before and after master plan, which I think I've already shown you, but really working with Andrew Grant, a really good landscape architect, to try and pick up the Yorkshire Moor quality of the landscape and then to just weave in specific uses. So we started by removing all the brick wall and all the cladding, which was really quite an impressive thing to do. So you could see right through the building. Then we repaired the concrete, and with English Heritage, what they wanted us to do was to repair it so that it could live a long time, but to show the repair, to demonstrate that we had repaired it so that you could see what was old and what was new. And then we tested the colors and created a palette of 4 colors, from burgundy red to orange to yellow, which was if you look carefully on the existing building, the bricks are of slightly different colors, tones, that relate to the 4 different streets in the sky. And so the top row is about preserving the concrete and keeping the rawness. The second is about color, and the third is about the poetry of the landscape and the branding of the building, I guess. Keeping old switches and keeping pieces of timber into the concrete. And I love that image, because we have if you squint, it's the same building, but yet now there's much more light in each flat. The insulation is far better. The color relates and has the same intelligence as the original scheme. And we've gone from this diagram to this diagram. And it's now even more interesting because the flats are being occupied, and then you get the richness of the curtains and the different lives of the different flats and the different lights at nighttime. This was the entrance, kind of miserable, low-level entrance with bad graphics, bad color, and if you didn't live in Park Hill, you wouldn't want to go through that door because you would feel like you didn't belong. It's like somebody before me said there was a gated community for poor people. It was like that. It was like you don't come in if you don't live here, and that can never be right in terms of my understanding of the porosity of the urban fabric. Every part of the public realm should be public and should be welcoming. So we made the entrance 4-story high. You can just about see it. We put 2 glass lifts on the main facade. We created this big spiral staircase as a means of escape. That was just a gesture of saying, Park Hill has changed. Come in, come and see us. And then in terms of the landscape, just by a few changes, a few trees, a bit of color, cleaning up the concrete, suddenly you go from that to that, and it didn't cost money. It cost a bit of money, but it didn't cost a lot of money. It was just a good gesture. And now there are new businesses in Sheffield that are desperately wanting those office spaces at ground level. And they say if they got £1 for every time they're being photographed in their working environment, they'd be very rich, because everybody's just photographing this building. And there's a real shift in attitude towards brutalist modernist buildings. This is the office spaces. This is the view of the from down the park. This is I always like the before and after, because it makes me feel like something has changed. And this is the view from the station. So this is when you arrive in Sheffield, you look up the hill and you see this building, and rather than saying, I'm a fortress, it just smiles back at you and says, welcome. We changed the flats in a similar fashion to the Balfron Tower, i.e. creating an open plan. It's a bit dark, but we created also windows into the streets in the sky, and we narrowed the streets in the sky themselves. We created this little cluster of 4 doors that are a little mini community. We created the bit of space that we gained from the street in the sky, we gave to the flat, and was a place for prams and bicycles. We kept the rawness of the concrete and just created a beautiful timber staircase coming down. We practically did nothing to the flat except to put a timber floor. And we created, some say, you think I'm living in social housing. I live in a penthouse overlooking Sheffield and the hills of Yorkshire. And then really simple kitchens, simple bathrooms, and a building that now says welcome and is transparent. And this is the architect. This was really a lovely moment. In the middle, this is the Ivor Smith, who's 85, I think, now, and all the time he didn't say anything about what we were doing. He was really keeping quiet. And then he came to visit the site, and he thought it was wonderful. He was like amazed. And he said, "Oh, you've put the windows there," and it was like many strange things happened. Like the reason why there were so many bars in the windows and the windows were so small is because 50, 60 years ago, people were worried about falling. And he approached the window really slowly, and it was only when he experienced it and he knew it was double glazing that he felt, yeah, it works better. I can look down, I can look up, I can look at the view. It's better, and for many, many reasons he was really happy. And this is my last slide, and somebody wrote a piece of graffiti on the building which said, "I love you, will you marry me?" It actually said the name of the lady he wanted to marry. And it's not a perfect story because he didn't marry the girl, but it became a perfect story for us because it was as if the building had said to us, I love you, will you marry me and save me from being demolished? And the Urban Splash then decided, when we finished the building, that it was such a good metaphor that they would put neon signs in front of the graffiti and to keep it. Thank you very much.